I would like to also, from my end and from our end, from the university's end, welcome Professor Rosemarie Garland-Thomson. And it's really a very happy occasion to have you here and have you here all the way from the United States, specifically for this Disability Film Festival. We have organized, as Peter already said, a few of these festivals. It's the first time that we also sort of connect an more academic part to it. And so every year we actually try to sort of make the films around a particular topic. And this year we have chosen the topic in between. And basically this actually refers to sometimes the situation that disabled people find themselves in, not being categorized as clearly this nor that, but sort of in between sort of dominant categories. I think we have started to look at this from a perspective that this is not necessarily something that is really bad, something that needs to be avoided, but rather something, this kind of hybridity is something to work for, to work from, and that this can actually, as we discussed this morning, can be actually generative, that it can be a critique of existing society, but also a contribution to it. And so this is the sort of thing that, that we would like to work on. So as Nancy already introduced a number of your books, I think the book Staring is a very important one because what you do in this book is to sort of make an analysis of the gaze and how the analysis of the gaze, how we look at people and how people look back at us, how that is mediated and sort of shaped by the phenomenon of disability. And staring is definitely one of those phenomena. Your most important, sort of your first work was actually about the freak shows in the United States, and that is not independent of sort of shaping up of American society with the immigrants, with the way that actually a normative norm was there and how it sort of challenged a number of things. You have also worked on a number of edited books, particularly in relationship to representations and museums. And so your current work is about habitable worlds, how we inhabit the world, eugenic logic and inclusive logic. And I believe that maybe what we're going to hear is going to appear in that book, maybe sooner or later. So I think without further, I would like to give you the word. And once again, I would like to thank some of the people that have made this possible, the province of Brabant for hosting us here, the organization Equal Rights for Every Person with a Disability, the University of Ghent, so we get to work also with other universities in Flanders, which is good, and also collaboration between different departments, you know, the Department of History, the Faculty of Education and Psychology, and our own Faculty of Social Science. So it's a sort of a very nice mix and collaboration that this has that made this possible. So without further ado.
Good afternoon. Is that loud? one needs to be strong. Thank you.
And clever.
And clever. Thank you very much to the province of Brabant, to Leuven University, and the various institutions, the various units and departments, as well as other universities who've sponsored this wonderful initiative in disability studies, and for inviting me here. Thank you in particular, my colleague and collaborator and friend, Patrick Devlinger. The title of my talk tonight does come from a book I'm working on eugenics, and I'll talk more about eugenics in the paper. I've entitled the talk, Why Disability? Or Who Should and Should Not Inhabit the World? So, this afternoon I'll be considering the question of why we might want disabled people in the world. And let me begin here with the 1568 Peter Bruegel painting called The Cripples. This painting suggests a fundamental contradiction about disability as a human condition, I want to suggest. The Cripples shows a humble group of 4 men with what today we would call mobility impairments. The men are using a variety of prosthetic devices that range from crutches to a prototypical wheelchair. The men are out and about in the public world amongst fellow subjects. They're in public buildings. They're perhaps scouting out the area for the best begging situation. The faces of the 2 of the gnome-like figures express a kind of confused attentiveness, with mouths agape and searching, if perplexed, eyes. The other 2 men seem concentrated on the task at hand of getting about in an inaccessible terrain. Although this is a scene of begging, most probably, all 4 men are deeply engaged in the challenges of navigating their world with a disability. This representation expresses uncertainty rather than assurance. It shows humility rather than entitlement. It shows persistence rather than privilege. And it shows ordinariness rather than distinction. In short, the parable I wish to draw from this painting is that disability presents at once a problem and an opportunity for solutions. In other words, in disability, in all things disability, we find a contradiction. This contradiction is summed up in these 2 assertions from disability studies scholars. One is from David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, and it says, disability is the master trope of human disqualification. The other is a quote from me that says, what we call disability is perhaps the essential characteristic of being human. Now, Mitchell and Snyder's claim suggests that disability restricts, it excludes, it renders one exceptional, it disqualifies. But at the same time, my own assertion suggests that disability gathers us into the everyday community of embodied humankind. If disability is inherent in the human, how can it then, at the same time, disqualify us from full membership in the human community? How can disability be both an occasion for inclusion then and exclusion? And that's the question I want to examine today. So this contradiction that's inherent in disability can be found in what I have called world building. World building is the shared human project of making and using our world together. The premise of world building is that the shape of the material world that we design, build, and use together both expresses and determines who inhabits our shared world and how we use that world to exercise the duties and the privileges of citizenship in that world. Modern culture in the US and other developed and developing societies are now understanding two contradictory world-building initiatives that are expressed in the social, the legislative, material, the culture, and the attitudinal practices of those developing worlds. One world-building initiative, which I will call here inclusive world-building, seeks to integrate people with disabilities into the world by creating an accessible, barrier-free material environment. Inclusive world building frames disability as valued social diversity, and it supports the civil and human rights-based understanding of disability that we find in legislation such as the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and 2000, and of course, broader initiatives such as the United Nations Convention on the Treaty of the Rights of People with Disabilities, all of which aim to integrate people with disabilities as full citizens. And I understand that Belgium has recently signed the UN treaty, and we hope the United States will as well. In contrast to this inclusive world building is the initiative that I call eugenic world building, one that strives to eliminate disability, and along with it, people with disabilities from human communities through varying social and material practices that range from seemingly harmless to egregiously unethical. Restrictive environments that segregate people with disabilities from one another and from the non-disabled population are one form of eugenic world building. Another form are scientific and medical technologies such as genetic manipulation, selective abortion, and medical normalization that are justified by the idea that social improvement and freedom of choice require eliminating the devalued human traits in the interest of reducing suffering, increasing life quality, and building a more desirable citizenry. Eugenic world building, in short, then, is the ideology and set of practices that control who enters and who participates in the shared public spaces of a democratic order. This material contradiction between inclusive and eugenic world building suggests that the world that we are making at this time and in this place, together and in this time, both wants and does not want disabled people in it. In other words, in these simultaneous contemporary world-building initiatives, disability is an occasion for both inclusion and for exclusion. The question that this contradiction raises, of course, is how we reconcile a world that rewards diversity of all types, but yet still emphasizes particular standards of acceptable bodies and function. Here's one recent specific example of this world-building contradiction. An October 2011 New York Times Magazine article reports that the neuroscientist and physician named Alberto Costa, whose daughter has Down syndrome, is researching drugs that he hopes will yield treatment for people with Down syndrome by increasing their quality of life and developing their potential for inclusion in a world that values intellectual capability. Alberto Costa explains that he is in a losing race for funding, with scientists who are developing new prenatal genetic tests which are less invasive and administered earlier that will identify fetuses with Down syndrome for possible elimination. Now, this funding disparity, he suggests, reflects our cultural preference for building a world without people who bear the variations that we think of as Down syndrome. Costa's story suggests that the kind of research he is undertaking supports an inclusive world-building initiative, whereas the preferentially funded prenatal testing research supports a eugenic logic that would eliminate people like his daughter from our shared world. How then do we understand this eugenic logic, modernity's sustained commitment to eliminating disability from the human condition, this literalizing of disability as disqualification that Mitchell and Snyder identify as the master trope of our shared world? Why, eugenic logic asks, should the world we build together include disability at all? After all, our dominant understanding is that disability confers pain, disease, functional limitation, disadvantage, social stigma, it limits opportunities, and it reduces the quality of lives. Eugenic logic tells us that our world would be a better place if disability could be eliminated. Enacted worldwide in policies and practices that range from segregation to elimination, the aim of eugenics is to eliminate disability and, by extension, disabled people from the world. Eugenic logic is then a utopian effort to improve the social order. It is a practical health program, or sometimes a social justice initiative that is simply common sense to most people and is supported by the logic of the modern era itself, a point I'll develop further later on. Against the eugenic commonplace that assumes that the world should eliminate disability, I want us to consider here together the bioethical question of whether disability and disabled people are something we might not just want to tolerate, but that we might want to conserve. In order to do this, I'm going to consider here a range of what I call counter-eugenic positions and perspectives. They range from the instrumental to the pragmatic, from the ardent to the skeptical. Taken together, these perspectives constitute a conversation about how disability acts as the master trope of human disqualification. And these speculations about disability might be good, however, for reframing disability as a resource rather than a restriction, for offering a reading of disability as generative rather than limiting. In other words, the conversation I want to offer you for the rest of my talk asks, what cultural and material work does disability actually do in the world? What I want to explicate then here for you today is what I sometimes call the because of rather than the in spite of counter-eugenic set of positions. In other words, I will explore what disability as disability and what disabled people as we are in the world contribute to our shared world. Now, I don't mean productivity in capitalist economies or contribution through the individual agency or acts of people, but rather I want to think through the generative work of disability and people with disabilities through our presence in the world. Put another way, I want to ask what we lose besides individuals themselves if we eliminate disability and disabled people from the world. Attending to what disability contributes, then, requires focusing on the generative potential of disability rather than on the restrictive potential of disability. The tension between disability as a universal and persistent human experience, like we saw in Bruegel's picture, The Cripples, and disability's cultural work as a disqualifier, intensifies, I want to suggest, disability's generative potential. As disability studies has amply pointed out, once we begin to attend to disability, it's everywhere in the cultural products that arise from our collective consciousness. As both a generative concept and a fundamental human experience, then, disability generates circuits of meaning-making in the world, and this is one of my most important points. The meaning-making potential of disability, then, can be organized into three interrelated themes or registers here, and I'll talk about those in the rest of my talk. First is the narrative, then the epistemic, or the knowledge building, and finally the ethical. Under these three themes, I find a sustained and complicated counter-eugenic argument for conserving disability. First, disability as a narrative resource. From the unsettling contradiction of disability's universality and its disqualifying potential come some of our most enduring and our most canonical cultural narratives. Disability is apparently close to the quick. It's a perpetual narrative resource, perhaps something resolutely human after all then, and interesting inheres in disability itself and the lives that we make with disabilities. And I think the film festival is a testimony to the narrative resource of disability. For example, Sophocles' tragic hero, Oedipus the king, is one of the founding protagonists of Western culture. Oedipus's tragic flaw, of course, is hubris, the Promethean aspiration to know the terrible truth of his own fate. Oedipus's life journey has bookends of disability. His parents, the king and the queen, expose their newborn to die on a mountaintop with his ankles bound together, for which he is named Oedipus, meaning swollen or broken foot. The mark of his damaged foot provides the irrefutable evidence of his identity and, of course, of his terrible fate. Laden with his inescapable self-knowledge, Oedipus grabs the truth of who he is, knowingly taking his fate into his own hands by gouging out his eyes and starting down the road alone. Disability, of course, defeats hubris. With this dramatic act, the playwright Sophocles expresses a kind of alignment of the hero's body with his identity, making Oedipus, like Tiresias before him, into one of the canonical figures of classical Greek tragedy, the blind seer. Another disability narrative as resource. In his 1995 book, The Wounded Storyteller, Body, Illness, and Ethics, the sociologist Arthur W. Frank puts forward a strong argument for disability as a narrative resource in the form of what he calls self-story. Whereas some narratives appreciate disability as a narrative resource for the non-disabled, Arthur Frank, in contradiction, values the narrative potential of disability for disabled people. The contribution of disability narrative in Frank's account is to counteract disability's social disqualification, to use Mitchell and Snyder's phrase. Few of us, as Mitchell and Snyder suggest, will willingly become disabled or welcome disability into a life in this contemporary time or place. The birth of a disabled child or the onset of disability is usually seen as a catastrophe or as a failing. This is so because being disabled shifts one into a very unappealing and unexpected social position that the medical sociologist Talcott Parsons in 1951 called the sick role. It's a place on the edge of the circle of human commonality where one is exempt from social roles and is obliged to get well soon. Narrative is a productive rather than a compensatory resource for Arthur Frank in his ardent defense of disability's contribution for self-understanding and identity formation. Using the more literary language of wound and illness rather than the politicized and the rights-invoking language of disability, Arthur Frank asserts that being the author of one's own disability story, and I quote, transforms fate into experience through narrative's restorative potential. Frank considers the narrative of his own wounding and the proposed utility of a wound-telling story to be what he calls a survival kit. Disability, in Arthur Frank's account, is an opportunity to develop what he calls voice, by which he means the capacity for making a coherent causal account from the arbitrary temporal incidents that comprise acquiring, adjusting to, and experiencing the transformation of self that is becoming disabled. For Frank, voice expresses body in storytelling, and it redeems through order making and reintegration into the human community. The work of narrative, of course, is selecting and linking random incidents to make a structured story with a beginning, a middle, and an end that puts retrospective order to the baffling chaos of experience that washes over us at every moment. Fortified and calmed with story, we are then equipped to navigate what happens next by folding it into our story of what has already happened and into the stories of those who've gone before and will follow us. Telling one's disability story is an antidote to disability disqualification, to the social banishment, and the apartness of the sick role, and the stranger-making function of disability stigma. Making disability narrative integrates one into the human community by generating, and I'm quoting Frank here, the common bond of suffering that joins bodies in their shared vulnerability. Frank thus transforms the tragic narrative of disability as isolation into a comic narrative of disability as belonging. Sooner or later, Frank tells us, everyone is a wounded storyteller. Thus, Arthur Frank's notion of wounded storytelling illustrates how disability can be an occasion for both exclusion and inclusion, but that resolution of contradiction can come through the process of narrative making. Okay, the next theme, the second, is disability as an epistemic resource. That means disability as a knowledge-making resource. For Arthur Frank, the generative work of narrative is to produce knowledge through rendering life experience into coherent and usable form. Disability narrative can thus contribute to knowledge-making as an epistemic resource. What psychologists call embodied cognition suggests that people draw on their bodily experience not only to think and know, but also to construct our social reality. In other words, our bodily form, our function, our comportment, our perceptual understanding, and our way of mind shape how we understand our world. So this critical exploration has yielded terms that range from oppositional consciousness to standpoint epistemology to insider-outsider perspective and to subjugated knowledge, a term I'll introduce next. The bioethicist Jackie Leach Scully has argued persuasively that a distinctive and what she calls a morally privileged knowledge can arise from the experience of living through a disabled body. And I think this was suggested earlier by my colleague Nancy. Disabled bodies, as Jackie Leach Scully explains it, produce what she calls experiential gestalts, or ways of knowing shaped by embodiment that are distinctive from the ways of knowing that the non-disabled body develops as it interacts in a world that is built to accommodate it. This thinking through the variant body, to use Scully's term, can be a resource. For example, the deaf-blind activist and writer, American Helen Keller, gives an account of how embodied cognition generates what Scully calls subjugated knowledge in Helen Keller's 1908 collection of essays called The World I Live In. Helen Keller's enforced unreliance, I call it, on the dominant senses of hearing and sight provide her with a generative opportunity to develop instead very vivid tactile, taste, and olfactory knowledges that often remain dormant in sighted and hearing people. Whoops. Helen Keller narrates what might be called a disability synesthesia as she smells horizons, recognizes people by the touch of her hand, and that she knows scarlet from crimson. And I think this is very interesting. She knows orange from red through perceiving the olfactory, that is the smelling distinction between the smells of an orange and the smell of a grapefruit. Her very well-developed subjugated knowledge leads her to the observation that the typically sensed people are limited by what she calls, and I think this is very clever, being smell blind and deaf. Touch, she concludes from her distinctive way of knowing, is, and I quote Keller, a great deal the eye's superior, she leaves us with. So finally, I want to introduce the idea of disability as an ethical resource. me get adjusted. So the rationales that I've offered you here today for disability conservation begin in disability's propensity to generate narrative, and in turn, narrative's ability to generate knowledge, and finally, for my explication here to you today, generates an explicitly ethical counter-eugenic logic. So my final and most complicated counter-eugenic argument that I will offer you today comes from the American Emily Rapp in her 2010 New York Times opinion piece and her Slate blog. Emily Rapp makes a critique of the Promethean aspiration, the hubris of knowing who we are, in her wrenching account of her experience and her understanding of parenting a child with a fatal disease. Emily Rapp offers a humble argument for disability conservation that honors the pain, the loss, and the suffering that's fundamental to much of disability. Emily Rapp's 18-month-old son, Ronan, at the time that she wrote the article, was born with Tay-Sachs syndrome. It's a very rare genetic Tay-Sachs. It's a rare genetic condition which causes a slow developmental regression into paralysis and sensory loss, which is irrevocably fatal by about the age of 3. And it's important to know that Emily Rapp's son Ronan died about a year ago at the age of 3. The condition represents a perverse reversal of our imagined developmental trajectory, foreshortening an entire life course into a chillingly compact arc. With Tay-Sachs disease, the disintegration we expect to languidly stretch over 7 decades instead rushes by in a mere few months. Tay-Sachs is, of course, the exemplary worst case put forward widely in arguments for reproductive counseling, genetic testing, and selective abortion. It is the anchor of any reasonable eugenic argument, and this is a very important point. As such, Emily Rapp's son, Ronan, offers the most difficult and the most controversial case for disability conservation. Moreover, that Emily Rapp herself had 2 screenings for the condition that did not indicate its presence itself complicates what is often taken to be a clear-cut case for genetic testing and selective termination. Emily Rapp herself, who by the way identifies as a person with a disability, said that if she had known that her son Ronan would have Tay-Sachs disease, she would have selectively aborted her pregnancy in order to prevent the suffering of both her son and her parents throughout this experience. The prevention of suffering is, of course, one of the major eugenic arguments for eliminating disability and disabled people at all life stages. The Nazis, the ethicist Peter Singer, supporters of physician-assisted suicide, and the reproductive rights movement have all used the logic of preventing suffering in some way to argue against disability. The American novelist Flannery O'Connor has warned of the peril, rightly so I think, that sympathy for the suffering of others can all too easily lead to the gas chamber. But Emily Rapp and her son's terrible situation offer a consideration other than these well-worn conversations about suffering. Now, while it would be perverse to reduce the complicated and the contradictory understandings that Emily Rapp offers about her son's dreadful condition, one point that makes Emily Rapp's story clear is that, one point that Emily Rapp's story makes clear is that suffering expands our imagination about what we can endure. More than this, however, Emily Rapp's account of what Ronan's disability imposes upon her clarifies a less recognized aspect of disability's distinctive work in the world that is worth conserving, or at least worth considering conserving. Disability in general, and in particular, Ronan's dramatic disability, offers an experience-based counter-narrative to the modern subject's understanding of the present moment as an opportunity to shape the future. Let me say this again. It's a very important argument, and I'll expand on it. Ronan's dramatic disability offers an experience-based counter-narrative to the modern subject's understanding of the present moment as an opportunity to shape the future. To explain, living with her son's disability compels Emily Rapp, in other words, to, in her words, live without a future, to cultivate a primary, self-defining interpersonal relationship in the lived present that presumes no future. Emily Rapp's forcible abandonment of the future, then, stretches towards understandings and experiences that expand what she, and perhaps even her son Ronan, might have had in an ordinary, non-disabled life together. The terrible contribution of Ronan's disability is rooted in the present and in presence. Disability speaks, I suggest, only in the present. The prodigious cannot be prepared for, and it anticipates nothing in our control. Disability cannot be prepared for, and it anticipates nothing in our control. Like Arthur Frank's wound-telling stories, Emily Rapp's story of what she calls the even blissful and magical world of the mundane, and what she calls its terrible freedom from expectations, could not be restorative in Arthur Frank's sense, but it may indeed be transformative. One might say then that Emily Rapp's story could be just one more version of lessons from the disabled for the non-disabled. But I want to suggest instead that this forcible abandonment of the future that Emily Rapp explains is something more complex and more capacious. It is a modern counter-eugenic ethics. Now let me talk a little bit about eugenics as I finish. Eugenics is about controlling the future. Eugenics is the ideology and it's the practice of controlling who reproduces, how they reproduce, and what they reproduce, in the interest of controlling the composition of a particular citizenry. The very idea of shaping a community or a national citizenry through technological and legislative practices that control reproduction is very distinctly modern. This modern understanding of the relationship between present actions and future outcomes is expressed in many aspects of modern cultures and is, in fact, one of the hallmarks of modernity. It's codified in modern nation states, modern culture, and modern subjectivity. Even in modern design, it's been argued. Zygmunt Bauman finds modern genocide, for example, rooted in rationality, efficiency, science, bureaucracy, and its manifestation in the nation state. In short, in what Max Weber has called rationalization, which is the hallmark of modernity. The interrelated concepts of evolution, progress, and improvement comprise a temporal aspiration for both individuals and societies that is crucial to modernity, what James R. Benninger calls the control revolution. The impulse to control the future, then, is the overreaching concept that makes the case against disability. Disability is then a conceptual category that represents something that goes beyond actual people with disabilities, and this is one of my most important points. Disability represents a problem with time as it is formulated in modernity. Disability and illness frustrate modernity's investment in controlling the future. Historian Douglas Bainton argues, for example, that efficiency and increased pace in task performance in all aspects of daily living that became the dominant value and way of life during the 19th century shaped our cultural understanding of disability as representing inefficiency and intractability. Bainton's historical account suggests that as the modern understanding of time as a commodity developed, of the present moment as an opportunity for investment in the future, disability came to be seen not just as simple misfortune or punishment or blessing or an omen from an either benevolent or angry God, but rather intransigence embodied. Disability and people with disabilities, then, are eugenic targets because we embody the unpredictable and the intractable nature of temporality, of time. We frustrate modernity's fantasy that we determine the arc of our own histories. Emily Rapp confronts then our collective investment in the future, in what is sometimes called futurity, which I've suggested is distinctly modern and differs from traditional worldviews. Thus, disability becomes, for modernity's Promethean aspiration, its hubris, to control the future, at once its greatest opportunity and its greatest repudiation. Curing cancer, taking apart the conjoined and making them singletons, flushing out the gene for Tay-Sachs are challenges in the interest of controlling the future, of controlling the outcomes in the future, controlling the future by shaping how human beings are and who we have among us. The problem is less controlling the outcomes in general than the problem of what outcomes it is that we attempt to control. In other words, the problem is not so much about making the future that we want, but the problem is rather how we go about deciding what future we might want together. So disability's contribution, its work, is to sever the present from the future, more precisely to be, as I have suggested, a narrative resource that does not mortgage the present on the future. More simply than an antidote to modernity's overreaching and hubris, disability contributes a narrative of a genuinely open future, one not controlled by the objectives, the expectations, and the understandings of the present. Disability then re-scripts, it rewrites modernity and the modern subject's temporal practices and understanding. Emily Rapp's son Ronan's imminent and vivid mortality. Indeed, people with disabilities and disability in general present a difficult challenge for modern subjects, not only to live in the moment, but also to engage in relationships not based on the premise of a future. Disability demands that we all might imagine a subject without a future life trajectory that is perpetually managed in the present moment. The important complexity, then, of Emily Rapp's story of her son and her family is to be able to hold on to the contradiction of the work that disability does in the world. For Emily Rapp, it is suffering entangled with joy. Rapp's navigation of this contradiction is her story of Arthur Frank's woundedness, both hers and that of her son. This is what the political scientist and ethicist Michael Sandel has called, and I conclude with this concept, the giftedness of disability. Thank you.